Welcome to our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Definitely a book that got people talking.
For sure. And we're diving into it today because so many of you out there are trying to improve yourselves, trying to figure out what really matters.
Yeah, and this book kind of turns the typical self-help advice on its head.
It really does. So get ready for some ideas that might surprise you and maybe even make you rethink how you approach, well, pretty much everything. Now let's break it all down. We have an expert in untangling these complex philosophical and psychological ideas.
Happy to be here. Ready to dive in.
So the book opens with this guy, Charles Bukowski. He was a poet, and let's just say he wasn't exactly known for following the typical self-help playbook.
Bukowski was definitely a unique character. He lived a pretty self-destructive life for a while, but he eventually found success later in life, and I think part of that was his brutal honesty. He didn't try to be anyone other than himself, which I think ties in really well with what Manson's getting at.
And get this, the inscription on his tombstone reads, "Don't try." Talk about a contradiction, right? Especially for people interested in self-improvement.
It does seem kind of counterintuitive, but it's not about giving up on your goals altogether. It's more about letting go of that pressure to, conform to what other people think you should be doing. It's about finding what truly matters to you and embracing who you really are and just going for it. Have you ever felt that pressure to achieve something that you knew deep down wasn't really important to you?
Oh, yeah, all the time. It's
Yeah.
so easy to get caught up in what we think we should be doing.
Exactly. And Manson is saying we need to stop and question those shoulds. He says we all have a limited amount of energy to care about things. So if we try to care about everything, we end up overwhelmed and actually less happy.
So how do we decide where to focus our limited, facts?
Well, Manson talks about this thing he calls the feedback loop from hell.
Uh-oh, that sounds intense.
It can be. Imagine you're feeling anxious about a presentation you have to give. That's normal, right? But then you start feeling anxious about feeling anxious, which only makes the anxiety worse.
Oh my gosh, anxiety about anxiety is the worst.
It is. And this can spiral out of control. You get stuck in a loop of negative thoughts and feelings. This is actually something that psychologists call rumination.
So how do we escape the feedback loop from hell?
Manson argues that suffering is unavoidable. It's part of life. What matters is choosing your struggles. He has this funny metaphor to illustrate this point, the disappointment panda.
Okay, now I have to hear about this panda.
So picture this panda being brutally honest with you. He says, no matter what you do, no matter what choices you make, you're always going to have problems. You can't avoid them. You're just trading one set of problems for another.
So, there's no escaping problems.
Right. So the key is to choose problems that are actually worthwhile, problems that align with your values and help you grow as a person.
That's a really different way of looking at things. Instead of running from problems, we should be choosing the ones that matter and leaning into them.
Exactly. It's about being proactive instead of reactive. And it's a crucial shift in mindset for anyone who's serious about self-improvement. If you're constantly avoiding challenges, you're never going to grow.
That reminds me of the story Manson tells about the Buddha. He had everything, riches, comfort, but he was miserable.
Right. The Buddha realized that trying to avoid suffering actually leads to more suffering. True happiness, he found, comes from accepting that challenges are just part of life and then finding meaning within those challenges.
So it's not about seeking out suffering, but about changing how we think about it when it inevitably shows up.
Exactly. And that's a really important point to keep in mind as we explore more of Manson's ideas.
Okay, so we're starting to see the big picture here. But how do we actually put these ideas into practice?
Manson dives into the importance of defining our values and figuring out what really matters to us. He tells a story about a man who was obsessed with his height.
Obsessed with his height.
Yeah, he believed that being taller was the key to happiness and success, but it was an external measure completely out of his control.
So he was chasing something that he couldn't actually change.
Exactly. And that led him to a lot of unhappiness. Manson argues that we need to choose values and goals that are meaningful to us and that we have the power to actually influence. What would you say are your markers for success? What really matters to you?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
But what about those times when problems hit us that we have absolutely no control over, like a sudden illness or losing your job?
That's where Manson's distinction between fault and responsibility comes in.
Okay, what's the difference?
He says that while we might not be at fault for everything that happens to us, we are always responsible for how we choose to respond.
It's like that quote, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it.
Exactly. Even in the face of difficult circumstances, we always have a choice in how we interpret and react to what's happening.
So it's not about blaming ourselves, but about recognizing that we have some control, even when it feels like we don't.
Right. It's about taking ownership of your life, even amidst adversity. You always have a choice in how you respond to your experiences.
I like that. This concept of choice keeps coming up. Choosing our values, choosing how we respond to problems. It makes me think about the importance of setting boundaries.
Definitely. Manson actually uses Romeo and Juliet to challenge how our culture romanticizes love.
Romeo and Juliet talk about a tragic love story.
Right. And Manson argues that healthy love requires boundaries and the ability to accept rejection. It's about recognizing that you are responsible for your own well being and you can't rely on someone else to make you happy.
That's interesting because we usually think of Romeo and Juliet as the ultimate love story, but their relationship was actually pretty unhealthy.
It was. They were so consumed by their need for each other that they didn't have any boundaries. They didn't take responsibility for their own well being. Manson points out some common unhealthy relationship patterns like the victim savior dynamic, where one person constantly needs rescuing and the other feels obligated to be the rescuer.
So, how do we set healthy boundaries in our relationships? Is it as simple as learning to say no?
It's a good starting point. Manson says that being able to say no, both to ourselves and to others, is crucial for protecting our values and our emotional health. It means recognizing that it's okay to prioritize our own needs and we don't have to please everyone all the time.
That can be really hard, especially in romantic relationships where there's this pressure to avoid conflict.
It can be. But Manson argues that healthy relationships involve honest communication and a willingness to express your needs and boundaries, even if it leads to disagreements. It's also about being able to accept rejection gracefully.
Rejection is never fun, but it is a part of life.
It is, and learning to deal with it without taking it personally is so important for maintaining healthy relationships and a healthy sense of self. This goes back to the idea of not giving a feck, not in a cold or heartless way, but in a way that allows us to let go of things that are outside of our control or don't align with what we truly value.
So it's about being intentional with our energy, choosing to care about the things that really matter, and letting go of the rest.
Exactly. And that leads us to an idea that might seem a little counterintuitive at first. True freedom comes from commitment.
That does sound counterintuitive. Our culture is always telling us to keep our options open and not settle down.
Right, but Manson argues that committing to something, whether it's a relationship, a career path, a creative pursuit, can actually bring a deeper sense of freedom.
It's like closing some doors allows us to open others more fully.
Exactly. He describes his own experience traveling the world, chasing new experiences, but ultimately finding more satisfaction in committing to his writing, his relationships, and building a life in one place.
So by making choices and committing to them, he actually created more freedom for himself in those areas.
Precisely. He found that true freedom comes not from having unlimited options, but from making conscious choices and going all in on those choices.
And that brings us to maybe the most powerful and also maybe the most challenging chapter in the book, the one about death.
It's definitely a heavy topic. Manson shares a very personal story about losing a close friend, which had a profound impact on his perspective on life and death. He connects this experience to Ernest Becker's denial of death theory.
Okay, what's that all about?
Becker argued that our fear of dying drives us to seek meaning and validation, often in ways that aren't really healthy. We create these immortality projects, things we believe will outlive us and give our lives meaning, like chasing fame or fortune or trying to leave a legacy.
It's like we're trying to cheat death by leaving something behind.
Exactly. And Manson suggests that accepting our mortality can actually be incredibly liberating.
How so?
It frees us from the pressure to chase those external markers of success and allows us to focus on living a meaningful life right now in the present moment.
It's like that saying, you can't take it with you. When we're faced with our own mortality, all those superficial worries and anxieties tend to fade away, and what's left are the things that really matter, our relationships, our experiences, the impact we have on others.
Exactly. Manson goes as far as to say that confronting death can actually be a source of joy. He describes standing on a cliff in South Africa, feeling the vastness of the ocean and the immensity of the sky, and realizing that his personal worries felt incredibly small and insignificant.
Wow, that sounds like a powerful experience.
It was.
Yeah.
And that acceptance of his own mortality allowed him to let go of his fears and insecurities and just embrace the beauty and fragility of life. It's about shifting our perspective and recognizing that our time is limited, which allows us to focus on what truly matters in the time we have.
It's about making each moment count.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Manson's core message, the subtle art of not giving a feck. It's not about apathy or indifference, but about choosing our battles, choosing our values, and ultimately choosing how we want to live our lives.
So, by accepting our own mortality, We free ourselves from the things that don't matter and can focus on what does.
Exactly. Manson isn't saying we should give up on all ambition or goals. He's urging us to look at what's driving us, to make sure we're not wasting our fucks on things that ultimately don't bring us joy or meaning.
It's about being mindful of where we direct our energy and attention.
Exactly. It's about choosing our battles wisely. And I think that's a great segue into the next part of our conversation, where we'll explore how we can actually put these ideas into practice in our everyday lives.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
So we've been talking about some pretty big ideas: accepting mortality, choosing our battles.
Yeah, for sure.
But Manson doesn't just leave us there. He gives us some practical advice for how to deal with something we all experience.
Failure.
Oh yeah, failure is definitely part of life.
It is. And Manson actually embraces it. He talks about how failing early in his career was a good thing for him.
Really? How so?
He describes graduating college during the recession, couldn't find a job, felt like he was failing at everything. But he says that this period forced him to face his fears and take some risks that he probably wouldn't have otherwise. So like hitting rock bottom pushed him to do things he wouldn't have done before.
Yeah, exactly. It pushed him outside his comfort zone. And that leads to what he calls the failure-success paradox. He uses the example of Pablo Picasso, who was incredibly productive throughout his whole career.
Yeah, Picasso was always trying new things,
Hmm.
even when he was already super famous and successful.
Exactly. And Manson argues that this willingness to embrace failure, to push beyond what felt comfortable, is what allowed Picasso to become so successful.
So it's not about avoiding failure, but about changing how we think about it, seeing it as a necessary step on the path to success.
Exactly. It's about seeing failure as a part of the process, not the end of the world.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we change our relationship with failure?
Manson emphasizes the importance of taking action, even if you don't feel motivated or inspired.
He's saying just do something, even if you don't feel like it.
Exactly. He challenges this idea that we need to wait for motivation to strike before we take action.
I think a lot of us do that. We wait for that perfect moment or that burst of inspiration.
We do, but Manson says it often works the other way around. Taking action, even a small step, can create momentum and actually lead to motivation.
So action comes first, motivation follows.
Exactly. And this leads to another interesting point about commitment. It seems counterintuitive, right? In a culture that's all about freedom and keeping your options open.
Yeah, we're told to never settle.
Right. But Manson argues that committing to something, a relationship, a career, a creative project, can actually give you a deeper sense of freedom.
Because you're not constantly second-guessing yourself or wondering what if.
Exactly. You can focus your energy and attention on the thing you've chosen and block out all the distractions. He uses his own experience as an example. He spent years traveling the world trying new things, but he eventually found more satisfaction in committing to his writing, his relationships, and building a life in one place.
So he found that by making choices and sticking with them, he created more freedom for himself.
Precisely. He argues that there's a level of depth and meaning that you only reach when you've dedicated yourself to something for a long period of time. It's about going deep instead of just skimming the surface.
I can see how that connects with his idea of choosing what to give a feck about.
Absolutely. But choosing what to care about also means taking a look at our beliefs and values. What are the things that are driving us? Are they really true?
We all have stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are.
Right. And Manson points out that a lot of these stories are based on assumptions or interpretations that might not be accurate. Or they might be based on values that we've inherited from our families or society that aren't really serving us anymore.
So we might be clinging to beliefs that are actually holding us back.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be willing to question our beliefs, to examine the evidence, and be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
I think a lot of people are afraid of being wrong.
They are. But Manson actually encourages us to seek out doubt. He says that certainty can be the enemy of growth because when we're certain about something, we stop being open to new information or new perspectives.
So doubt can actually be a good thing.
It can. It creates space for curiosity and exploration and ultimately for growth. He gives an example of a man who's convinced that his sister is marrying the wrong person. And he's creating all this drama because of his certainty.
Sounds like he's giving too many frocks about something that's not really his business.
Right. And Manson suggests that this man ask himself two simple questions. What if I'm wrong? And would being wrong create a better or worse problem for me and everyone involved?
So he's forcing himself to consider the other side of the story and to question his own certainty.
Exactly. And those are questions we can all ask ourselves when we find ourselves getting really worked up about something. It's about taking a step back and checking our assumptions.
Okay, so we've talked about failure, commitment, doubt.
Right.
Now, what about responsibility?
Ah, yes, responsibility. Manson says that taking responsibility for our lives, our choices, and our emotions is essential for true freedom and happiness.
But sometimes things happen that are out of our control, right?
They do, and Manson acknowledges that, but he also emphasizes that even when things aren't our fault, we still have a choice in how we respond.
We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of being dealt a bad hand in cards. We can't change the cards we're dealt, but we can choose how we play them.
I like that. So it's not about blaming ourselves for everything, but about recognizing that we do have some agency. We have the power to influence our experience, even in difficult situations.
Right. And this leads to a really powerful idea that might seem counterintuitive at first. Embracing our imperfections can actually make us stronger.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about this.
He talks about a study of World War II survivors who had experienced incredible trauma and hardship. And the researchers found that the survivors who were able to find meaning and resilience were often the ones who didn't shy away from their pain and their imperfections.
They acknowledge their struggles and vulnerability.
Exactly. And in doing so, they were able to tap into a deeper well of strength and resilience.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. Manson argues that our struggles, our failures, our imperfections are all part of what makes us who we are. They teach us and they shape us.
So it's not about avoiding those experiences, but about seeing them as opportunities for growth.
He compares it to physical exercise.
Yeah.
We have to push our muscles to their limits, experience some pain and discomfort in order to build strength and endurance.
So it's like emotional pain can also be a catalyst for growth.
Exactly. And that's where Manson's message becomes really hopeful, because it suggests that we all have the capacity to grow and learn and become more resilient, even in the face of really difficult challenges.
It's about shifting our perspective from why me to what can I learn from this?
Precisely. And that shifting perspective leads us to another important point. Manson makes the danger of entitlement.
What does he mean by entitlement?
Our culture often promotes this idea that we deserve to be happy and successful all the time. But Manson says that this can actually backfire, because when we're always focused on what we deserve, we become less resilient, less adaptable, and less equipped to deal with life's challenges.
Because life is never perfect and things don't always go our way.
Exactly. And when our expectations don't match reality, we set ourselves up for disappointment and frustration. Which brings us to another crucial point, taking responsibility for our emotions.
It's so easy to blame others for how we're feeling.
It is. We might say things like, you made me angry, or you're making me unhappy. But Manson argues that this is just a way of avoiding responsibility.
So while other people can definitely influence our emotions, we are ultimately responsible for how we feel and how we react.
Exactly. And that's really empowering, because it means we have a choice. We can choose how we interpret and respond to situations.
So it's not about suppressing our emotions, but about choosing how we express them and how we let them affect us.
Precisely. And this ties back to the idea of setting boundaries. When we take responsibility for our own emotions, we're better able to set healthy boundaries in our relationships.
So we don't get caught up in unhealthy dynamics where we're letting other people dictate our emotional state.
Exactly. We become more independent and more in control of our own well-being. And setting boundaries often starts with that simple word, no.
It sounds simple, but I think a lot of people struggle with saying no.
They do. But Manson emphasizes that saying no is essential for protecting our time, our energy, and our emotional health. It's about recognizing that it's okay to prioritize our own needs, and we don't have to please everyone all the time.
And it's also about being able to accept rejection gracefully.
Yes, rejection is a part of life. And learning to accept it without taking it personally is crucial for healthy relationships and a strong sense of self. It goes back to that idea of not giving effect, in the sense of not letting other people's opinions define our worth.
I like that. So we've talked about responsibility, boundaries, emotions. Now what about success? How do we define success in a way that's healthy and fulfilling?
Manson argues that we need to be careful about the metrics we use to measure success. We often get caught up in external markers like wealth status or achievement.
Because those are the things society tells us to value.
Exactly. But those metrics can be really misleading, because they don't necessarily reflect our true values or what actually brings us happiness. He uses the example of Dave Mustaine, the lead singer of Megadeth.
He's a pretty successful musician, right?
He is. But he was constantly comparing himself to his former bandmates in Metallica, who had become even more famous and successful. And even though Mustaine had achieved what many would consider to be incredible success, he still felt like a failure.
So even though he was objectively successful, he didn't feel successful because he was using the wrong yardstick.
Exactly. And Manson argues that this is because he was measuring his worth based on external validation instead of focusing on his own internal sense of satisfaction and fulfillment.
So it's not about achieving a certain level of external success, but about defining success in a way that feels true and meaningful to you.
Exactly. It's about aligning your goals and your actions with your values. And that brings us back to that important distinction between fault and responsibility.
We keep coming back to that.
It's a fundamental concept in Manson's philosophy. He's saying that while we may not be at fault for everything that happens to us, we are always responsible for how we choose to respond.
Like we talked about earlier, it's about recognizing that even in difficult situations, we still have some agency. We still have choices.
Right. And this leads to another really interesting idea Manson explores: embracing uncertainty.
Uncertainty, isn't that something we're usually told to avoid?
It is. Our culture often pushes this idea that we need to have all the answers, a clear plan, and total control over our lives. But Manson says that's just an illusion. Life is inherently uncertain, and trying to control everything only leads to anxiety and frustration.
So instead of fighting against uncertainty, we should learn to accept it.
Exactly. He actually suggests that uncertainty is where creativity, innovation, and growth come from. When we let go of the need to know everything for sure, we open ourselves up to new possibilities, new experiences, new ways of being in the world.
That can be scary, but also kind of exciting.
It can be both.
Yeah.
It's about leaning into the unknown and trusting that the journey will unfold as it's meant to. And this openness to uncertainty connects to another important theme in Manson's work: authenticity.
Authenticity, what does he say about that?
We often feel pressure to present a certain image to the world, to be someone we're not.
Yeah, like we're all trying to fit in or please others.
Exactly. And Manson says that trying to be someone you're not ultimately leads to unhappiness. He believes that true happiness comes from embracing your authentic self, including your flaws and imperfections.
It's about letting go of the need to be perfect and just being yourself.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the foundational elements of Manson's philosophy: the importance of values.
Values. What's his take on that?
He argues that our values are like the guiding principles that shape our choices, our actions, and ultimately our lives.
So they're kind of like our compass.
Exactly. And he makes a distinction between good values and bad values.
Okay, so what makes a value good or bad?
He says that good values are grounded in reality, they're socially constructive, and they're within our control. So, for example, honesty, integrity, compassion, those are good values.
Because they're based on a realistic understanding of the world, they benefit both ourselves and others, and we have the power to cultivate them.
Exactly. Bad values, on the other hand, are things like superstition or the need to be right all the time or trying to control things that are outside of our control.
So those values are based on faulty assumptions. They often lead to conflict and unhappiness, and they're ultimately impossible to achieve.
Right. So it's not just about having values, it's about choosing values that are healthy and empowering.
And Manson says there's a connection between our values and our problems.
Yes. He argues that our problems often reflect our values. So if we're constantly running into the same types of problems, it might be a sign that we're clinging to values that aren't really serving us anymore.
So like if you're always stressed or overwhelmed, it might be time to take a look at your values and see if they need to be adjusted.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the idea of choosing the right metrics for success.
Like we talked about earlier, it's about defining success on your own terms, not based on what other people say or what society tells you.
Right. It's about figuring out what truly matters to you and then aligning your actions and your goals with those values. Manson uses the example of Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles.
Oh yeah, what happened to him?
He got fired right before the band became huge, and for years he struggled with that experience. He felt like a failure. But eventually he came to terms with it, realized that he was actually happier without the fame and fortune that came with being a Beatle.
So he found his own version of success outside of the band.
Exactly. He found fulfillment in his family, his relationships, and his own music. And Manson uses this story to highlight the importance of defining success based on your own values and what truly brings you joy, not on external markers of achievement.
It's about creating a life that feels authentic and meaningful to you.
Precisely. And that often involves letting go of things that no longer serve you, whether that's grudges, past hurts, or negative beliefs about yourself.
It's like we're carrying around all this baggage that's weighing us down.
Exactly. And Manson argues that letting go of that baggage, even if it's painful, is essential for creating space for new experiences, new relationships, new possibilities.
It's like cleaning out your closet.
Yeah.
When you get rid of all the clothes you never wear, it creates space for new things.
Right. And letting go of emotional baggage can be just as liberating as cleaning out your physical clutter. And that leads us to another powerful practice that Manson advocates for gratitude.
Gratitude. Yeah, I've heard that's good for you.
It is. And Manson goes as far as to say that practicing gratitude can actually change our brains.
How so?
When we focus on what we're grateful for, it shifts our perspective from a place of scarcity for a place of abundance.
So instead of focusing on what we don't have, we start appreciating what we do have.
Exactly. And this can have a huge impact on our overall happiness and well being. It's like that saying, count your blessings.
It's about training our minds to look for the good.
Precisely. Manson suggests that taking a few minutes each day to reflect on the things you're grateful for can actually rewire your brain to be more positive and optimistic. And this practice of gratitude can also lead to greater self-compassion, which is another key theme in Manson's philosophy.
Self-compassion. Yeah, that's something a lot of people struggle with.
It is. We tend to be much harder on ourselves than we are on other people. We criticize ourselves for our mistakes, our flaws, our perceived shortcomings.
And that just makes us feel worse about ourselves.
Exactly. And Manson says we need to learn to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a friend.
So instead of beating ourselves up for our mistakes, we need to be more gentle and forgiving.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and we all deserve love and acceptance. And that leads us to a really powerful act that can be challenging to practice forgiveness.
Forgiveness. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Manson talks about how holding on to grudges and resentment can actually harm us more than it harms the person we're angry with. It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Wow, that's a really powerful image.
It is. And Manson suggests that forgiveness is ultimately an act of self-care.
So it's not about condoning the other person's actions, but about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment.
Exactly. It's about choosing to let go of the pain and move on with your life. And that brings us back to the importance of choosing our battles wisely.
Choosing our battles. How does that relate to forgiveness?
Well, Manson points out that we often get caught up in arguments or conflicts that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. We might spend hours debating politics or religion or even which brand of coffee is better.
And those arguments rarely lead to any real change or understanding.
Right, they just drain our energy and add negativity to our lives. So Manson is saying that it's important to be selective about what we choose to invest our energy in.
It's about knowing when to walk away.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the most important themes in Manson's work, the importance of setting boundaries.
Boundaries. It seems like boundaries are really key to living a fulfilling life.
They are. Manson argues that setting boundaries is crucial for protecting our time, our energy, and our emotional well-being.
So it's about learning to say no to things that don't align with our values or that drain us.
Right, and it's about being clear about our expectations and limits in our relationships. It's about communicating our needs and being willing to step away from situations or relationships that aren't meeting those needs.
So setting boundaries is really about taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. And that leads to another important aspect of Manson's philosophy, self-care.
Self-care. What does he say about that?
He points out that we often prioritize the needs of others over our own needs.
Like we're always putting everyone else first.
Right. We might work long hours, neglect our health, or sacrifice our own happiness in an attempt to please others.
And that can lead to burnout, resentment, and a loss of sense of self.
Exactly. And Manson argues that self-care is not selfish.
It's about recognizing that you need to take care of yourself in order to take care of others.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between meeting your own needs and meeting the needs of others. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
You have to fill your own cup first.
Right. And that brings us to another practice that Manson emphasizes the importance of living in the present moment.
We talked about that a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting.
Definitely. We often get so caught up in regrets about the past or worries about the future that we forget to appreciate the present moment.
It's like our minds are always somewhere else.
They are. And Manson is reminding us that the present moment is all we really have. It's the only place where we can experience true joy, connection, and fulfillment.
It's about being here now.
Exactly. It doesn't mean we should never think about the past or plan for the future, but it's about finding a balance between reflecting on the past, planning for the future, and savoring the present moment.
So it's about being present in our lives as they're happening.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of gratitude.
We've talked about gratitude a few times now. Why does Manson keep coming back to it?
Because it's such a powerful practice. When we focus on what we're grateful for, it changes our brains. It shifts our focus from scarcity to abundance.
So instead of focusing on what we don't have, we start appreciating what we do have.
Right, and that can have a huge impact on our overall happiness and well-being. It's like we're training our minds to look for the good even in difficult
It's
situations.
like a mental workout for happiness.
You could say that. And this practice of gratitude can also lead to greater self-compassion.
Because when we're feeling grateful, we're less likely to beat ourselves up for our mistakes or shortcomings.
Exactly. And speaking of self-compassion, Manson talks about the importance of forgiveness.
Forgiveness. It's a tough one for a lot of people.
It is, but Manson argues that holding on to anger and resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die.
That's a pretty powerful image.
It is, and it highlights the fact that forgiveness is ultimately an act of self-care.
So it's not about condoning the other person's actions, but about freeing yourself from the pain and the negativity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that you can't control other people's actions, but you can control your own responses. And that brings us back to the idea of choosing our battles wisely.
Choosing our battles, what does that have to do with forgiveness?
Well, Manson points out that we often get caught up in arguments or conflicts that ultimately don't matter. We might spend hours debating politics or religion or even something as trivial as which brand of coffee is better.
And those arguments rarely lead to any real change or understanding.
Right. They just drain our energy and add negativity to our lives. So Manson is saying that it's important to be discerning about what we choose to engage in.
It's about knowing when to walk away.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of setting boundaries.
Boundaries again. It seems like boundaries are a really important part of Manson's philosophy.
They are. He argues that boundaries are essential for protecting our time, our energy, and our emotional well-being. They're about learning to say no to things that don't align with our values or that drain us. They're about being clear about our expectations and limits in our relationships. And they're about being willing to walk away from situations that aren't serving us.
The boundaries are really about self-respect.
They are. And they're about recognizing that you deserve to be treated well and to have your needs met.
So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But there's still more to explore. We'll dive deeper into Manson's ideas in the next part of our conversation.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck.
Yeah, we've talked about values and responsibility and boundaries and so much more.
And it all comes back to this idea of making conscious choices about where we direct our energy and attention.
Right. It's about deciding what really matters to us and then letting go of the things that don't.
Exactly. Manson's message is ultimately one of empowerment. It's about recognizing that we have the power to create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling.
It's about taking ownership of our lives and our choices.
Exactly. And it all starts with figuring out what you truly give a feck about.
It's not about being apathetic or indifferent, but about being selective with our energy.
Right. It's about choosing your battles wisely.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. It's made me think about areas in my own life where I might be giving too many firks to things that don't really matter.
We all do that sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about where I might be holding myself back by trying to live up to other people's expectations.
It's so easy to get caught up in that trap.
It is. But I think Manson's book gives us a really helpful framework for breaking free from those patterns and creating a life that feels more authentic and more fulfilling.
Definitely. He gives us some practical tools and strategies for navigating the challenges of life and for figuring out what truly matters.
One of the things that really resonated with me was this idea of choosing our problems.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept.
It's a reminder that even when things are tough, even when we're facing difficult situations, we still have a choice in how we respond.
We can choose to dwell in negativity, or we can choose to look for the lessons and the opportunities for growth.
It's about shifting our perspective from feeling like a victim to recognizing our own agency and ability to influence our lives.
It's about taking ownership of our experiences.
And that's really what this book is all about. It's about taking responsibility for our lives, our choices, and our happiness.
And it's about not giving a feck about the things that don't matter so we can give more flecks to the things that do.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found this conversation insightful and maybe even a little bit challenging.
Remember, it's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask tough questions, to challenge your assumptions, and to keep growing and evolving.
And most importantly, it's about figuring out what truly matters to you and then having the courage to live a life that reflects those values.
So as you go out into the world, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep choosing what you give a feck about.
Thanks for listening.